All right. So yeah, I'll just be, I'll just try to gauge by the look in your faces how long I'm going to make, right? Just, depending on how you look, I'm just going to keep on going or wrap it up a bit quicker. So you can be very tactical here. So what I want to talk about today is, this is essentially the big data landscape. We just, this is not even everything. We just touched upon a small part of it, really, and today I'd like to talk about all the rest of it, all of these small icons here. So we're going to be here for a while. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just going to, what I want to really do is just highlight a few of them. So the ones I feel are going to be useful for you or can be useful for you, right? And yesterday already somebody asked me about Spark. And I would like to cover that because I think this is very relevant. It has some nice extensions that I think are very useful for you. So Spark is essentially a system that has been developed after MapReduce that I introduced yesterday, right? MapReduce, you define two pieces of software, the map phase, reduce phase. All the data on the left-hand side, the input data will be read in the map phase. Something will be computed, it will be aggregated in the reduce phase, and then everything will be written again to the output on the disk. The problem with that is it's a very simplistic programming model, right? Not all the problems you're facing can be easily mapped to these two MapReduce phases, and sometimes, or actually oftentimes, what you end up doing is you have several iterations over this from input to map, reduce, output, and then you go again to input, map, reduce, and output, and so on. And that becomes very costly because every time you write to the hard disk, and that's very slow, right? So what the people who developed Spark said, this isn't good enough for iterative algorithms, not good enough for machine learning, and I think that's where it becomes interesting for you. Or for interactive data mining tools. And so what I said is, let's put everything, all the data, quite aggressively into main memory. Main memory, simply much faster than hard disk. That's what I try to illustrate here. I'm not sure how easy it is to kind of understand this figure, but the main point is that we have the CPU in the middle here, which does all the data processing. And the bandwidth to the main memory is 40 to 60 gigabyte per second, and to disk it's only 0.2 to 1 gigabyte per second. And so it's much more efficient to keep everything in main memory, and main memory will grow for the foreseeable future. The issue, however, is main memory is not persistent, right? If you pull the plug, if the application crashes, all your data will be lost. But what Spark does about this, I will talk about in a few minutes. And so the goal of Spark is essentially, the way I look at it, is it's a main memory MapReduce with a bit more sophisticated programming paradigm, a bit more methods you can use to process the data. But it has all the good things of MapReduce still, right? This fault tolerance, what happens if one of the workers crashes, that will all be taken care of. Data locality, moving the code to the data, not the data to the code, as well as the scalability. So it has all these good things of MapReduce. And so what Spark really adds is this idea of a resilient distributed data set, or an RDD. And that's essentially the data set in main memory. A bit more in detail, so these RDDs are immutable collections of data, very much like MapReduce, this key value abstraction, right? And they are basically built, initially taken from disk, and then transformed in multiple steps, processed, and they can be cached throughout. And then in the end, they're going to be written back to disk. But the important bit really is that they essentially are in main memory, and that's what makes this whole thing makes Spark very efficient. And then we have the same thing as in MapReduce. We have operations on this data, on these RDDs. And this is essentially, again, a reduce operation that we can implement, and then also collect, count, save, and other abstractions. Just want to make one short example to show you kind of the simplicity or comparative simplicity of the code. So this example here tries to, not just tries, what it actually does is it takes a file, a log file, and tries to find patterns in it. This is a very typical application for MapReduce or for Spark, because it is kind of finding these patterns in log files is something that can be easily parallelized, because we can basically work on each line in parallel. So what this code here does is it takes a text file, the log file that we want to analyze, it takes this from disk. This is the base RDD, and then we can do is apply certain operations on that. We say we're going to filter on that. We're only interested in the lines that start with error. That then becomes a transformed RDD. Then we split the errors with the map operation, and at any point throughout the execution we can say cache that into main memory such that we can easily or efficiently execute that again. And then we can again, on this cached RDDs, what we can then do is we can again apply filters. We're interested in all the lines that, or error lines that contains the string foo, and then we can count that, right? And this is particularly these two operations here are operations that can be done very, very efficiently in parallel, right? It's going to, again, what it's going to do is it's going to spread it out. It's going to take this cached RDD here, cache messages here. This is going to be distributed all over the cluster in all the machines in the main memory of the machines, and then we can efficiently do this in parallel, right? And there is one simple result, one kind of experimental result here. If we do this for a full text search on Wikipedia, with Spark this is going to take less than a second. With MapReduce it's going to take more than 20 seconds. And, it's a factor of 20. 20 seconds and still isn't that much, but for larger applications, for bigger applications, this can become a real pain point. This writing to disk, particularly if we do it repeatedly, if we go through several cycles of map and reduce. Just basically how Spark works. Like I said, we have this idea of an RDD. We have transformations between them, or operations in RDD. One important point is that all these operations are lazy. That means nothing, well, not nothing will ever be done, that would be bad. But these operations are all going to be executed lazily only once we use an action. I'll tell you what this is on the next slide. Only once we execute an action, the result will actually be computed, right? So, and we have different operations where we have transformations that define a new RDD. Like I said, RDDs are essentially immutable. So we take an RDD, we apply any of these transformations here, and we get a new RDD. Again, lazy, nothing happens until we execute one of these actions that are actions that return operations that return the result. And the most important one here is reduce, which is the same as in MapReduce, right? We have also other actions like collect or count and so on. Simple actions. Now, I initially said this can become an issue, right? Having everything in main memory, because we might be losing it if the power goes off, or if we have any other kind of problem in the application, it might crash, we lose everything. Now, the idea is that this doesn't happen very often, which is a very optimistic assumption, but it generally holds. And with Spark, what Spark does is it keeps the lineage of all the transformations, operations on the RDD, and so it can always kind of retake these steps. So if we look at this, what we've done before, with the example, right, we had a HDFS, or let's just say an initial RDD. We filtered on top of it, then we did some mapping on top of it, right? We transformed it again, and then we cached it. Now, if we ever should lose this cached RDD here, Spark kept kind of this chain of events that it needs to reproduce the data, right? Or this cached RDD. So that's the idea. So what would happen in that case, it would go back, the whole chain, go back to wherever it has a persistent version of the RDD, and then rebuild everything on top of it. That's the basic idea. Now I just want to make one example here about how this can be useful. This is an example with logistic regression. I'm pretty sure most of you know what this is. The idea is to find the best line to separate two sets of points. In this specific example here, and we start with an arbitrary initial line and then calculate the distances and then try to fit it until we have the best line. The way this looks in Spark, we start with a text file, or we basically start with a file that contains all the points, the two sets of points, the blue ones and the red ones, if I remember well. We apply on these, we apply a map where we specify a function that reads the points. Then we cache that in main memory. We initialize the vector, the initial line, randomly, just a random line, and then we try to fit this in multiple iterations, try to find the best possible separation between the points. And what is happening in here, I don't want to go into too many details, but we work on the data, which is the points that we're adding initially. We apply the map, and for each point in the map or in the data, we calculate the distance to the line, and then we need to execute the reduce to actually, because that, if we just do the map, that's just lazily, that's not going to actually be evaluated. So we execute those reduce on top, and then we calculate the gradient, and then we iterate over the whole thing. So this makes it quite simple to program this kind of iterative large scale problems, right? And this is very little code. This doesn't take too much to develop. And really, the interesting bit about this is, you could do this in every different types of programming languages, environments. It's not something fundamentally new, but we don't depend on the size of the text file here, right? This can be arbitrarily large. Well, arbitrarily large. If it gets too big, you need a bigger cluster where you run Spark distributedly, right? But the idea being really, you don't have any kind of limitations with your hard disk, with your main memory, and it scales out very well and is parallelizes very well and makes execution of it very efficient. So this is essentially Spark. I want to talk about just very briefly about one extension of it and then another one which I find interesting. Spark has been very, very well integrated with R, in the sense that you can plug it into R, and you can also execute R within Spark. And the interesting bit is that Spark R has a lot of interesting data mining or machine learning algorithms already implemented as massively parallel, in the sense that it can easily parallelize this on large sets of data. So what is interesting, for example, to me, but maybe not to you, but I'm sure there's several interesting algorithms here listed here. This is not a complete list. I personally deal mostly with clustering, and this makes it very easy to scale out or do k-means, for example, on large amounts of data. And the integration is really very simple. You can easily load this into R and then use Spark, or kind of ship or move the computation out into Spark. Another interesting extension which actually makes, which actually is also not just easier to use, but is also quite efficient in my experience, is the idea of Spark SQL. That's essentially executing SQL on top of Spark. So you can, instead of writing the code that I've shown before, what you can do is you can use this abstraction of data frames, load the data, structure data in some meaningful way, and then execute your data processing as SQL on Spark. And my experience is also that this makes it much more efficient, because the query or the query optimization is much better than if you write your own code. What I want to say with this slide here, the only thing I want to say really is that, this shows a lot of architecture of Spark SQL, but you can use multiple different data sources as input to Spark SQL. You can use files in HDFS or Hive, which I'm going to talk about in a second. PostgreSQL, relational databases, etc. You can easily plug this in and then do processing, this kind of Spark SQL, on really on a large scale. And that makes it quite interesting, because scaling out other databases, if you have too much data for just one single machine, is quite painful. But with Spark with Spark or MapReduce, you can easily do so. Okay, so what I plan to do now is talk about two more kind of higher level of abstractions on top of MapReduce that help you to process data. And I just want to go to kind of like talking about large-scale databases on MapReduce before I then talk a little bit about data management, the Human Brain Project, from my perspective. So those of you who know SQL or relational databases, this probably won't be difficult for you to work out, but what I want to show here is kind of how to do joins on MapReduce, and then also talk about higher level abstractions like Hive and Pig Latin. So a join in relational databases is essentially the idea of combining two tables together over a shared attribute, right? We have here, as an example, two tables, R1 and S1, with a shared attribute SID, and we join that over the shared attribute SID and basically then obtain a table with all the information from R1 and S1 together. That's what a join is, and it's an operation that we have to do quite often in relational databases, but also in other forms of data processing, to taking two data sets together and joining them to kind of, well, combine the information, right? So the way this works in a bit of more abstract sense is we have two data sets, right? R and S. They all have all kind of values, all kind of columns here, and they have a shared key. And what we want to do with the join is find the tuples, these kind of color bars that have the same key, so matching the green R4 with the green key, with S3 with the green key as well, right? That's kind of the goal of the join. Now, how can we do this with MapReduce? Does anybody have an idea? Sorry? How can we do this? How can we join? So if we have this kind of data, we have these tuples here with the key, right? And we have a second set of tuples with key. How can we join that such that we get R4 combined with S3? And, you know, basically R2, which has a yellow key, with S4, which has a yellow key. How can we do this with MapReduce? What we can do is we take all these tuples and then we define in this kind of MapReduce notion, we say the kind of key over which we want to join, the join key, that's going to be the key in MapReduce, or MapReduce, and the rest is going to be the value, right? And what then MapReduce does for us in the reduce phase, basically combines these, right? Because the same key, the key value pairs with the same keys will end up at the same reducer. And then we get the join result for free, essentially. So that's kind of the idea, right? And this is quite, I mean, I'm not sure how, how easy or how difficult it is to appreciate this, but without kind of this abstraction of MapReduce, doing a large-scale join of massive amounts of data, of really large data sets, is a major pain. Because what you would normally do is you would probably just go, if you were asked to do this on your desktop machine or anything similar, right? You probably just iterate over all these tuples, take them into main memory, put them, the key probably in a hash map or a similar abstraction, and the value in the rest, right, in the hash map as well, and then try to join this, but you run out of memory, everything crashes. It's really painful to do, right? And you can't split the problem easily, because if you split it, you might not catch all the tuples you have to join, and so on. So this makes it really, really efficient to do large-scale data processing on MapReduce, right? But what we don't necessarily want to have is this idea of having to write Java code, right? This is not easy for people to do necessarily. So what would be interesting is to kind of develop sort of high-level languages, high-level abstractions that allow us to formulate what we want to do much easier, and then the system in the background generates the code for us, right? And I want to talk briefly, very briefly, about two such languages or systems. Hive, which is essentially SQL on top of MapReduce, and then Pig Latin, which is a bit of a scripting language. So both have been developed a while back. Both come from industry primarily. Hive was developed initially by Facebook, is now open source, and Pig Latin has been developed by Yahoo and has also been made open source. Hive, essentially, like I said, is a SQL on top of MapReduce. I want to show an example here where we count. There's a lot of word counting when it comes to MapReduce. Probably it's just the easiest example to make. So what we want to do is we want to take words from a Shakespeare collection, or we have two tables, one with words from Shakespeare collection, and then words from the Bible. And then we simply execute a query, an SQL query that finds the most frequent words in these two tables, right? And this is a very simple SQL query. This is standard SQL query. Now, what Hive does do behind the scenes, it takes this query, it generates an abstract syntax tree, essentially the code in multiple iterations, and then finally generates the MapReduce code, right? And this is painful to write. This is even just painful to read. But what Hive does for us is it takes this SQL query at the beginning and then generates all the rest of it. So we don't have to do this. So that makes it quite efficient to write and then efficient to execute on the large scale. Pig is similar in that it's essentially a programming language that then also executes, translates this to a Java or MapReduce job, and then can execute there. What this example here does is it loads two files, joins them, so it's one file with visits of web pages and the other with web page information. It joins them over a shared attribute and then groups them and tries to find users that visit pages with a page rank of more than 0.5. It's not that important what it does, but what I want to show here is really the kind of the high-level aspect of this language. It makes it very easy to program data processing, data manipulation jobs efficiently, and then you can just do this, scale this out into MapReduce. That makes it very nice. All right, so what I want to talk about now is data in the Human Brain Project. Who here is actually in some way affiliated with the Human Brain Project? That's not that many. I was expecting more. But anyway, okay, so now I removed all the slides about the Human Brain Project because I thought I was just going to be boring you. All right, so yeah, never mind. So what I want to talk about is essentially kind of my, you know, the Human Brain Project, obviously, goal, simulate the brain, understand the brain, and is organized in several different sub-projects, right? And I'm going to focus here on those kind of aspects, sub-projects that I've been involved in. There's also data management happening in other aspects of it, but I'm just focusing kind of on my experience and what I've done and seen so far. And then I will, in the end, I want to talk a little bit about the research we've done in data management in the Human Brain Project. So I've been working in two aspects. One is high-performance computing and medical informatics. Let me first talk about high-performance computing. So the idea there is to fundamentally simulate brain activity, right? Ultimately on the whole scale of the whole brain, but for the time being on a slightly smaller scale. What is done there is first a model is being built, which is then being simulated, right? What goes into this model is kind of literature information, how kind of, for example, how the different types of neurons are distributed across the layers, right? I gotta say here, I'm pretty certain there are a lot of people in this room who know much more about this than me. So, but you know, I'm looking at this from a computer science and data management perspective. What goes in is literature information, then also neuroscience data, of which there is plenty available in a reasonably structured form. Other things that go into it are lab data. So in, for example, the Blue Brain project, which was the precursor and kind of the root of the Human Brain project, lab data was actually, you know, the rats or rat brains were analyzed to rebuild the structure of neurons, single neurons. This all information goes together to build a detailed model of the brain or part of the neocortex of the rat brain that is then simulated on a blue gene or some other similar supercomputer, and that then results in essentially a kind of time series, I like to say, or kind of the voltage of certain parts of the brain measured over time, and it also goes into these fancy visualizations, right? And this is measured, or this is simulated on, like I said, on a, at least used to be, on a blue gene with 16,000 processors working in parallel on this, on simulating this small part of the brain, and that of course produces massive amounts of data, right? Like I said, massive number of time series, and typically in the order of terabytes, which is a lot to handle these days, right? A terabyte, if you want to store it, if you want to buy a disk that stores a terabyte, it's not going to cost you a lot, and it's also going to be efficient to store it on there. But then analyzing the data, that's the difficult bit. That's where it becomes really, really hard. So for me, there are two kind of aspects to simulating this brain activity in this part of the Human Brain project. This is basically data that goes in, literature, neuroscience data, lab data, and so on. And then what comes out, which are the time series. Then another aspect, the other part of the Human Brain project that I'm involved in is medical informatics. The goal there is very ambitious, is essentially to understand disease in the human brain. And the way we want to do this is to integrate all kind of data, patient data, in hospitals in a kind of federated way, so that we can then do data mining on top of this. Still, everything's very much, you know, safe, anonymized, and everything. But we want to then find kind of a good definition, objective definition of brain disease. So then ultimately what we can do is have better diagnostics for brain disease, potentially better treatments, and we can also simulate the healthy and diseased brain better. The way this works is, like I said, right, we take all the information in the hospitals, again, everything anonymized. We take, for example, the patient record and history, right, which is contains all kinds of information about the patient, what the treatments they had, and so on. We take MRI scans. Primarily, what we do with them is we extract features, size of brain regions, for example. That's the interesting bit that we're interested in. Protein markers, and then also genetic information, which I think we're actually not going to do these days, mostly because of privacy reasons. We take all this information, put it into a high-dimensional space, if you will, and then we do the kind of clustering on top of that, the data mining, to find these definitions of disease, right? And so now coming to the relevant bit, or the interesting bit in connection data management, is kind of how we can do all these things that I've been talking about. Like, you know, we have the literature analysis that we need to build the brain models, right? And this is, for example, this is done these days with Hadoop, right? We have loads of neuroscience data collections available, for basically freely available. This is typically very structured data, sometimes already available in relational databases. Sometimes it's still structured, we have to import it into relational databases. Lab data, it's the same thing, right? Lab data is very, very difficult, time consuming, and also expensive to produce. So it's very little and very well structured. So also this is stored in relational databases. And then finally, finally, there's a bit more, but we have streaming time series and time series analytics, which is what comes out of the supercomputer, right? For this we use Spark as well as Storm, which is evolution of Spark for real-time data. And so this is kind of like, I mean, I have to make the 2 points here. One is this is very much focusing on my experience with the Human Brain Project, right? There are other aspects, like, for example, I'm just now getting started with neuroinformatics, where there are different tools being used as well. So this is by no means complete, is what I'm trying to say. And the second point is that we have also a lot of static time series data and a lot of spatial data. A lot of the models that are built for simulation then ultimately are spatial data. That means they have kind of a spatial extent, they have spatial structure, they relate to each other in space, in three-dimensional space. And the reason why there are no kind of tools listed for these two types of data is because very few tools exist. And that kind of brings me over to talking about the research that we, with EPFL in the past, and still with EPFL, I have to say, and now with Imperial College, that we are doing in the context of the human brain. And that is what I want to talk about now, essentially. And I'm looking at the faces, nobody has dozed off so far, or very few people, I'm going to say. So I'm going to go on. Oh, we still have time, so. All right, so the data management challenges, the remaining data management challenges that are not very well covered by existing tools basically center around this idea of building models of the brain or parts of the brain, as well as simulating them. And the workflow is quite simple, right? We have typically observational data, other data as well. We have like the literature reviews, neuroscience repositories. That goes into a spatial model. I mean, that's the degree of kind of detail incorporated in the models that have been simulated in the Blue Brain project and now are being simulated in the Human Brain project. So we build a spatial model, simulate it. That produces a lot of output that we then need to analyze to kind of close the circle. We analyze the data, the post-simulation data, that feeds then into a new model, a more detailed model, or a more accurate model that is then again being simulated until we get everything right and actually understand how the brain works. And for this spatial modeling, what we need are three aspects, basically static 3D exploration. What that is, I'll talk about in detail. Interactive 3D exploration as well as spatial analysis. And then for the simulation, we also need to analyze data as we simulate. And for this, we need dynamic 3D exploration. I'm going to talk about primarily this one here, just as an example of the type of work that we have done in the Human Brain project. So the way this works, right, is, like I said, initially we build a spatial model of a small part of the brain. And this is very, very detailed indeed. Well, okay. It's a very, very detailed model. This is, for example, a representation of one neuron, and this is even downsampled. But what we try to do is really have a very accurate spatial representation of this neuron, right? And what we see here, this is the neuron. We have thousands of these cylinders that basically try to, that are kind of a discretized, volume-based representation of a neuron. Now, what is being done with that is these neuron models are thousands or millions of them, hundreds of thousands, millions, are then put together in one model, right? And wherever they intersect with each other, that's where synapses are placed, right? This is all neuroscience. This has been explained to me like this. The important bit for me is that once this model is put together, what has to be done is a lot of these three-dimensional range queries. So we want to, with one of these queries on the model, we want to retrieve what exactly it is in this part of the model, all these triangles, all these cylinders here we want to retrieve, right? The reason is that we need to make sure that the density is correct in all parts of the model, and in general that the model is biorealistic, right? So we have to execute thousands of these queries on top of this model. And so what we do need is an efficient spatial index. I touched on indexes very, very briefly on one of the first slides yesterday. I'd be surprised if you'd remember it in detail. But the idea of an index essentially is to avoid that we have to scan over all the data, right? If we store all this model, one of these models here on disk, and we want to execute, or we want to know what is in a specific area, what we can always do is just scan over the entire model, read everything from disk, and see what is exactly in this box there, in this range. That is inefficient, right? And so what an index is supposed to do is tell us, kind of be an auxiliary or an additional data structure that allows us exactly to pinpoint where on disk this part of the model that fits in this box here is stored, right? That's the idea of an index, or in this case of a spatial index. Now, this is not something fundamentally new. Indexes have been around for decades, and also actually spatial indexes have been around for decades as well. So a lot of work has been done already, but it wasn't really efficient enough for our purposes. So I just want to briefly explain kind of the work that has been done already. So this is an example which tries to very, very roughly, tries to approximate a couple of neurons, right? Now the way the state of the art, or the current spatial indexes, the art tree, tries to do this is it wraps all the cylinders, each cylinder, in a small blue box. I mean, the PhD student has done this, basically wrapping each of these cylinders in a blue box. That's a lot of PowerPoint work right there. Anyway, so it does this on the lowest level. It wraps each cylinder in a blue box, and then builds a tree at the same time with these blue boxes at the bottom. What it then does is it moves one level higher and packs several of the blue boxes in red boxes, right? And then also reflects that in the tree hierarchy. So the three blue boxes in this red box here, they will be connected, for example, with this red box to these three blue boxes there, right? That's the idea. And this keeps on going levels up. We have one more level with green boxes, and I think then comes the root level, the most top level, which contains everything. Now, if we want to execute a range query on top of that, the way we do this is we start at the root, right? And then we go down the tree to find the blue boxes that we are actually interested in. So the way we start is we go to the root, right? We see with which green boxes this intersects. Then we execute the same query on these green boxes. We check with which red boxes it intersects. We go to these red boxes, and so on, right? Now the fundamental problem is what it says here, right? This idea of overlap. The problem being that we have ambiguous paths in this tree. And this is, this is what I try to illustrate with this querying thing here, right? Because we don't know, these both green boxes intersect with the query, we have to follow both paths down the tree, right? You can see this here, essentially. If you query here, or even worse here, I'm not sure how easy this can be seen, but we have multiple green boxes intersecting with the query here. So we have to follow all of them down the tree. Now this is in this toy example, and like I said, this has been done by the PhD student. I only asked him to kind of show the ambiguity with two paths. In reality, this will be 100 or thousands of paths that have to be followed. I was reasonable there, and just, like I said, just had him do it for two different paths. That would have been a bit much, not much work there. But that's the idea, right? And this structure overlap, which there's nothing we can do about fundamentally, it degrades performance of query execution. we have measured this. What we have done is we took a data set with 100,000 neurons. We were representing them with 450 million 3D cylinders. That's about 27 gigabytes on disk, which really isn't much, right? And then we executed the query for each on each of these with different R3 variants on this data set. So what we've done is we increased the complexity of the data set. We took 100,000 neurons here, right? And then kind of made them into small data set that we increased on the x-axis, and on the y-axis we measured the time. And like I said, we did this for 3 different trees. This basically R3 variants, there's tens and hundreds of R3 variants available right now. We took the best ones and measured how long it takes. And as you can see, the results show there's a linear growth of the execution time, or the kind of time goes up linearly. That's not too bad. But the fundamental idea of the index is that it's supposed to decouple execution time from data set density, right? It's supposed to be really flat, essentially. The line is supposed to be flat because we want to look up where the stuff, where the data is, and then directly jump to this location and retrieve it from there. And the state of the art, the current indexes, don't do that, and they essentially don't scale with density. And so what we have done is we have developed our new index, a new index for that problem that tries to work around this limitation of overlap. So what we do on a very simple level, right, is we have 2 phases, each independent of overlap. We execute a query. In there, we find one random element in what we call the seeding phase. Find one random element, and then we basically try to find all neighboring elements through crawling after that, traversing kind of the neighborhood of the first initial element. And so we use this kind of connectivity of the data set to avoid the overlap in this structure, right? The problem is, can anybody see the problem here? Yes, this is interactive. At least minimally interactive. The problem fundamentally is, right, I said we take one initial element. This, we just arbitrarily chose this as initial element. Then we kind of use the connectivity of the data set. We don't really have connectivity everywhere, right? We have these neighboring elements here. We can maybe jump from each one to the next one, but we can't jump from this one to this one and so on. So there's not enough connectivity fundamentally in the data set. So the idea requires this notion of reachability, to the connectivity to go from one element to the next. Now that's exactly the issue, right? We have this requirement of connectivity. In such a data set, we don't have any connectivity. Sometimes in meshes, we do have a lot of connectivity. Everything's connected, but even then, if we have a query like this that splits the whole data set or the whole mesh into 2 parts, then we don't have any path between the 2 parts within the query. The question then can become, why don't we step a little bit out of the query? But that's always tricky because you never know. It might be never-ending, and you're never entirely sure whether or not a connection exists within the query. Now, for other kind of data sets, for example, for earthquake simulations, this is not a problem at all. Everything's connected. You can execute a query anywhere, and you can go from all the neighbors, or from one element to crawl from one element to all the other neighbors. So not every data set essentially has this connectivity required, and particularly not the neuroscience data sets, the spatial neuroscience data sets that we deal with. So what we've done is we developed this index we call flat, right? And we kind of induce, or we put this connectivity into the data set. What we do is, with the data set illustrated here, is we partition it. Right, we group, similar like all these R-tree variants, we group multiple elements into one partition, right? Ideally they're spatially close together. And what we then do is we link these partitions, the neighboring partitions, with each other, right? And that gives us this reachability, this connectivity that we need. So we add this connectivity, and with that we enable the crawling, the second phase of the algorithm. Then what we still need is now, you may remember, right, we need an initial element that we start with. We identify an initial element and then we go to the neighbor and recursive to their neighbors and so on until we have found everything within the query. The way we do this is we use an R-tree on top of this, right? This sounds a bit counterintuitive because I've just been bashing R-trees for a little while, right, saying they're not efficient, and they're not. But for our purpose here, it's not too bad, because the only thing we are interested in is any one element within the query, not all the elements. That's what I've been complaining about before. That's where the R-tree really isn't good. We're only interested in any one element within the range query. So the problem, right, of the R-tree overlap gets bad if things get complex. But what we can do now here, I mean, it gets bad because of the overlap. What we can do now here is we don't have to follow all the paths down to the leaf level. We only follow one of them because like I said, we're only interested in any element, not a specific one, but any element within the range query, right? And so we follow down one path, and that's a very efficient operation. That's essentially the complexity, in the algorithmic complexity, is going to be in order about of the height of the tree. So it's very efficient. So again here, with this kind of seeding, in the seeding phase, we avoid the overlap issue that the R-tree has. And then in the next phase, right, in the crawling phase, what we do is we find initially a seed partition, a seed element, and then we find all the neighbors. Oh, okay, the color is a bit off. But we find in several multiple steps, we find all the neighbors, then again the neighbors of their neighbors, until we have found all the partitions that intersect with the range query, right? And that's quite nice. With that, we basically, in this part, in this phase of the algorithm, we have a linear complexity in terms of graph edges in number of the number of kind of connections to the neighbors. Now, if we look at how this looks in terms of performance, it's probably obvious, right? I wouldn't be showing this if it wasn't really, really good. But what we did here is we repeat the experiment with the same data set with 100,000 neurons, represented by 450 million 3D cylinders, 27 gigabyte on disk. We execute 500 queries for each experiment, and what we do on the x-axis, again, we increase the data set size. So we take a subset, a sample of the full data set, and make it a bit bigger for each point on the x-axis until we get to the full data set at the right. And like I already said, or like I've shown already, this is kind of like the state of the art, the R-tree variants that we tested. And now if you look at flat, our new approach, right, this indeed stays very flat, because it essentially decouples execution time from the size of the data set and from the complexity of the data set as well. So that makes it very efficient, right? And for this rather small model that we tested it, 100,000 neuron, right, we get a speed up of 7.8, factor of 7.8. Okay, so essentially the index, what it does is it decouples execution time, like I said, from density. And the index has now been used by I'm not sure which, to be honest, I'm not sure which sub-project in the HPP. It's definitely been used by the guys in the Blue Brain project, and they managed to really build bigger models thanks to use of this index, because otherwise it just wouldn't scale to build and test the models. Okay, so I wanted to talk about one other aspect that we've done work in, which is the one of interactive 3D exploration. The problem there is that what is oftentimes needed is this idea of, kind of going through a structure, in this case here, in the case of neuroscience, through a neural network and executing multiple spatial range queries, right? So we're executing range query sequences. And the sequence is not random at all. There always is kind of a structure that is being followed. In the case of the neural network, this is of course kind of like the neurons, and we can make other examples. In the heart, it can be the arterial tree. In the lung, it can be the bronchial tree, and so on. So we always follow these structures through and execute range queries along the way. And this is kind of like, it's always kind of a guided analysis in these data sets, because we're following a structure and executing these range queries. And the execution of these range queries is always interactive, in the sense that we execute a query, get the result, and we don't know yet where exactly the next query is going to be. We only know this once we look at the result, and then we execute the next query after that. And the way this looks when we look at the disk and CPU is that we basically first execute the query, retrieve the data from disk. The disk is busy, then we have all the data. The CPU, the processor, will then kind of visualize that or compute anything on top of that, show it to us. At that point, we'll decide where the next query is. The disk will be busy, and then we go again the whole cycle, right? From retrieving query results to processing query results. Now, an obvious way to speed that up is to use prefetching. The idea being that we execute the first query, then we predict where the next query could be. Whilst we are processing the data from the first query here, we're already prefetching data for the next query where we suspect it might be. And then we can, when we have the next query executed, hopefully we already have all the data. We don't need much more data. So we don't need to spend as much time on disk, and then the whole thing repeats all over again, right? Because this is a really interactive way of executing query sequences, right? So that's the basic idea. And with this prefetching, we can hide the data retrieval cost. This cost here, essentially, this time here is used to keep the disk busy and retrieve as much relevant data for the next query as possible. Now again here, we're not the first to look at that. This has already been done before. But what we noticed when we took a few of these known approaches, like a straight line extrapolation, Hilbert prefetching, and so on, they basically look at the past query locations. And so we did a small experiment where we looked at the efficiency of these approaches. And what we did is we increased the volume of the queries on the x-axis here, and on the y-axis we looked at how many of the results that we prefetched can we actually use for the next query. And it's quite good. The result is quite good for small queries, but it deteriorates quite rapidly for bigger queries. The problem is that all these approaches only use the locations of past queries to extrapolate the next query. And this works really, really well for very small query volumes. But if you look at large query volumes, we can't extrapolate very well anymore, right? We only have these 2 points. And the path that we're following might twist, might bifurcate, might do anything within this large volume. So we can't really very well predict anymore where the next query is going to be. So these known approaches aren't very efficient for arbitrary query volumes. So what we've done is we thought, instead of just using the content of the previous query, instead of just using the position of the previous query, what we'll do is we'll look at the content which in itself isn't trivial, because the content is quite complex, right? Which one, these are all paths through the content of a query. This is even a downsampled query, but of all these lines in the query, which one are we following, right? It's not clear at all and makes it hard to predict. So what we need to do is really identify this kind of path that we're following. So what we do is we take the result of the range query, we approximate a graph structure, the lines in this query result, and then we identify the path that is being followed. And the insight that we're using is quite simple, which is the path that we're following must be in all the queries, right? So we start, this are all the paths in a certain part of the data set. We execute the query, the first query. These are all potential paths we're following. Any one of those could be it, right? Now we know the path that we're interested in, that we're following, I mean from a perspective of data management, must be one that is shared between these two queries, right? I mean the user knows which path they are following. We don't know. We, in the business of prefetching, don't know, right? So the path we're following must go through all queries, and after 3 queries we can already kind of identify or say it's going to be one of 2 paths. And then in the final query that I'm illustrating here, that I'm showing here, we know precisely which one is the path we're following, right? So after very few queries, we can already quite reliably say or tell which path we're following, and what we can then do is predict the location of this next query by simply following this path here. What we're doing So essentially the longer the sequence, the better the prediction, because the more we can narrow down this kind of path, this number of paths, these potential paths we're following. So it's quite difficult though to know exactly how much to prefetch. And so what we do is we identify the guiding path. Once we have the guiding path, we look at the exit and then just do a straight line extrapolation. And then we try to grow the area that we're prefetching. We first look at the safest region and then incrementally increase the region that we're prefetching to make sure we're getting the relevant result. Now, I think this almost brings me to a conclusion. I just want to show kind of how much better this solution is. We tested this again with, I think it was actually the same data set, with a 100,000 neuron data set represented by 450 3D cylinders, 450 million 3D cylinders, I should say. And what we measured is kind of, again, this metric of cache hit rate, which is how much of the data have we already prefetched before the query is actually being executed. Right, so we measure the cache hit rate and we compare again the three state-of-the-art approaches against our method, which is called Scout, the blue method here. And we tested this for different query volumes primarily. This here for very big volumes where we already know the other approaches don't do very well. And as we can see, right, we have an accuracy of up to 70%, whereas the others struggle to get up to 20%. So by actually taking into account the content of the queries, of the previous queries, we can accelerate or increase the cache hit rate of these interactive query sequences quite considerably. We also did an experiment on the second sequence with a small query volume. There the other approaches were slightly better with 30%, but also our approach Scout was much better with 90% accuracy. And that makes a huge difference if you look at how much the speed up potentially can become, right? So we have a very high prediction accuracy, and that results in an overall speed up of, when using prefetching with Scout, with our approach, we get a speed up of 15x, right? With the others, we still get a speed up because they get it right once in a while, so we get a speed up of 2x. But for, like I said, for Scout, the speed up is almost 15x. All right, with that, coming to the conclusions. So it's been quite a long presentation with, I think, with a few interesting messages. First of all, data management has undergone quite tremendous changes in recent years, and it's quite a recent trend that we've seen new applications, new use cases, new hardware that we needed to take care of, and I think new interesting design points or kind of new applications, new products or new software tools came available. I tried to highlight the ones that I think are interesting for use in neuroscience without being a neuroscientist actually, but be kind of having been exposed to this world for now a few years now. And so I tried to illustrate a little bit what is useful and how it's being used in the Human Brain Project, which I think serves as a good example for the needs of neuroscience. But still, there are still some applications that are not very well served or that are still not very well supported. I made the case for spatial data, and to some degree it's also for large-scale analysis of time series sometimes. Well, it's not very well supported. So there's still some work to do, but at the same time I think there's really a breadth of tools available that can be used to develop new insights in neuroscience. All right, with this I think I'm done. I would like to open for questions.